Let's compare what it's like to build a simple admin tool in both Retool and Internal. We're starting from the same point on both platforms with a Postgres database already connected and a blank space to begin. Now in Retool, let's first drag in our table component to display data. Retool fills this with dummy data at first, but what we want to do is grab data from our Postgres database. So in order to do that, what we'll need to do is create a new query in Retool. You see that we've already connected our Postgres database here. Now we just need to write some SQL to grab the data from Postgres. So this sample database is for a rideshare service. This table is called riders. It contains all of our user data. So let's go save and run our query. And so you can see some of the results are being returned back here. And now what we want to do is we want to go and replace all this dummy data and put in the data from query 1. And so now you see all of the data is in our table here. Next, let's add a filter so that we can easily find a specific user. Change this label to last name because we're going to filter based on their last name. And to make this filter work with our table, what we're going to need to do is go back to our query and edit the SQL to also reference the filter. So we want to say where last name is compared to our text input. And so now, once we save our query, we can see that our filter now filters this table. So that's how you set up a quick table and filter in Retool. If a PM or someone in ops or a less technical team wanted to do this, they'd have to know some SQL and some JavaScript in order to write the queries and bind the filter to the table. So now let's jump over to internal and see how we'd set up the same table and filter. Again, we're starting from the same place with our Postgres database connected and our blank space to start. And so we're going to drag in our first component, which will be a table. We'll select the Postgres database. And in this case, we're going to select a function to list our riders record. Now we'll go ahead and sort by ID and ascending. And there you have it. We're done. We've got the same table set up in the same order as we did in Retool, and internal tables actually come in with built-in search and filter inputs. So if we wanted to do the same thing and filter by last name here, we could. Or we can use this to filter by any other field. So if we wanted to search for a particular ID, we could also do that in internal. So internal lets you do this a lot faster. You don't need to write SQL, create queries, or write little code snippets to connect your components together. Internal generates all the functions that you need automatically once you connect a data source. Plus, not needing to write any code means that teams like PMs or ops can help build out the tools, so it's not completely dependent all on engineering. Now let's take a look at adding some forms so we can edit our data. Let's go back to Retool. We'll go and drag in a form component. So we'll click on Generate Fields from a Database, and then select the table that we want, which is the riders. Now everything looks good with the format and validation. We'll X at created at since we don't need this form to change that, and updated at and ID we're going to handle with some code in our query. So we don't need those as well, and we'll click on Generate Form. Now, since this is an update form, we can pre-populate these values with what is selected in this table by going through and then setting the default value to reference the table and then that specific column. So we want to reference the email here. And then for first name, we want to do the first name. And then same thing for the last name here. So now these will be pre-filled. Now, Retool has already created a query, but it's an insert query. We want to create a new update query. So we'll go here, switch it to GUI mode. And then once again, we want to update our riders table. We want to update an existing record in this case. And then for the filter, this is how we're going to identify the record. Let's identify it by the ID. And let's say we want to update the record that's selected in the table. So let's match the ID with the ID that's selected in this table. And then here in the change set, we kind of specify what we want to change. So in this case, you want to change the email, but we actually want to tie it to what's in this text input. So we want to say text input 2's value for the email. And then we'll do the same thing for our other fields. So for first name, we want this to be text input 3. And then for our last name, we want this to be the value in text input 4. We also want to update the updated at field. And in this case, what we can do is just have it run the moment JavaScript function, which will pick up the time at that moment and put it into the updated at field. Now let's go save this query. And we go to our forms event handlers and we change it to trigger that new query we just made, which is query 3. Let's hit the clear after submission toggle to clear out the form after we submit. And then to the event handlers in query 3, we also want this table to refresh. So what we're going to do is trigger query 1 to run once again here. So we'll save that. And so now let's take a look at our app. We can select it. You'll see that all the information is pre-filled in. If we change the name here, you can see that the correct item has been updated here. Now let's take a look at how we would make that same form in internal. All right, so in internal, what we want to do is make the same form. So we'll create a little bit of room. We'll go through and add our form component here. And then we're going to select Postgres for our database. And the function what we want is to update riders records. So internal automatically pulls in all of the required fields. So in this case, you only need the ID field, but we want to edit a bunch of other fields. So let's go ahead and add in email. Let's add in first name, last name, and updated at. And so we can leave created at behind just like we did in Retool. Let's drag this out so we can see the full form here. And then just like in Retool, since this is an update field, we want this to automatically be pre-populated with the data that we select in this table. So what we can do is we go to each field, just click on it, and then we can set the default value. And in this case, we want to pre-fill all the default values with that same data from the riders table. So the selected row, the data in that row, and then we'll grab the ID. And we can go ahead and do the same thing for the email and all the other fields. Now, one thing that we can do for updated at is actually just set this automatically to be the date and time that the form is submitted. And now, since the user can't change the updated at field, we can hide it from the form. We can also hide ID as well, since it's not something that we want the user to accidentally change. We can make this form a little bit smaller. And if we hop over to effects, We can see that internal already resets the form input values and blanks them out after form submission, and it automatically auto-updates by key, which means that since we bound these two components together, internal will automatically update this table once this form is submitted. So let's go ahead and check out how our tool works. Let's change your name back to Helga, and you can see that the information has been updated. So compared to building out this form in Retool, we didn't have to create our own update query or individually map the different components here to our query's change set. You only need to set the default values to the table row just like you did in Retool, but internal will handle the query and the mapping automatically. So that's a quick comparison of building in Retool versus internal. Thanks for watching.